You're listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.
Hi, it's Louisa Tanner Munson, and this episode of the Chiron series is about the ninth house. So in this podcast, we're going to look at how you might be affected if you were born with Chiron in your ninth house, and all the kinds of things that the wounded healer might affect in this house. We'll also look at how you can transcend the effects of Chiron in the ninth house and how you can work with the energies and make it work for you. And then towards the end of the podcast, we'll be looking at what happens when Chiron transits through your ninth house, if that is something that's coming up for you shortly. So I guess the first things we need to understand, because we have a quite good understanding of Chiron, but what we need to understand from the outset is the ninth house and what it controls, what it has dominion over. So the ninth house is closely linked to the star sign Sagittarius, which is in polarity to Gemini, and the ninth house is in polarity to the third house. So they're complete opposites. Now, if you've already listened to the third house, you'll understand that the third house is about knowledge and knowledge seeking, and it's quite a busy place where you get knowledge from those around you, your siblings, your neighbours, your cousins, the local environment, your early school experiences. So the third house and Gemini really is to do with early knowledge and collecting lots and lots of bits of knowledge. Conversely, the ninth house is the higher mind. So it rules all aspects of knowledge when it's been synthesized into something that's become very useful. So it's like knowledge that's applied, knowledge that is understood. So the ninth house is really about understanding and taking whatever you've learnt in the third house, and in particular on the whole journey through all the houses. It's the synthesization of that knowledge into the understanding. So as you can imagine, the ninth house looks at higher education. It looks at all matters of spirituality and expansion of the mind. So that can include travel and breaks from the usual work pattern. It's like spiritual hobbies, spiritual beliefs, religion, any kind of philosophical leanings are covered in the ninth house. It also looks at law and ethics and morality, how we can work through things, how we can make informed decisions based on all the early knowledge that we've accumulated. And so I guess it really looks at your reasoning powers, your ability to make sense of the world and to put it into perspective. It also looks at publishing and teaching from a higher perspective. So if you think of the actual nature of publishing and becoming an author, or I guess, a radio podcaster or somebody who is sharing knowledge on the internet, it's quite conceivable that it's not just based on knowledge, but it's based on the understanding as well. The most brilliant orators and publishers are people who have something to say based on knowledge that has been synthesized and understood from a completely different perspective. And that's the thing that people like about good publishers and storytellers, is that there's some kind of meaning there. There's some, there's some open perspective that comes to you. So we've got all these themes covered via the ninth house. It also looks at, when you do actually travel abroad, so not just holidays, but long-term trips and emigration and things like that. So it is a place of expansion and an open mind. So what happens if you've got Chiron, the wounded healer, in this house at the time of your birth? Well, it can have lots of different effects. I don't really have many real-life examples to really talk from. However, I have seen it in transit through the ninth house, so that also gives me a clue as to how it works. But if you think about the wounded healer and the kind of pain that someone might have to go through and accept to do with the ninth house, the kind of pain that you might get from childhood, it could represent all manner of things. On one level, it could represent a feeling of inferiority about forming your own opinions, that there is a fear of higher knowledge, and for you, the easier path to realization is just to have, the knowledge represented by the third house. So it might represent somebody who is fearful of expanding the mind, somebody who is fearful of studying for a particular purpose. It might be somebody who shies away from further education, or shies away from philosophy, or shies away from different belief systems. I imagine if you're brought into the world in a very strict family with very strict belief systems, a ninth house Chiron could really represent the sort of fear and anxiety that you might grow up and find out other things that betray your family's identity. So there's that kind of inference. It could also represent a fear and insecurity to do with travel, possibly because the pain that you experienced was because you travelled so far and weren't ready for it, or that your family moved away. So those kinds of themes are covered. It can represent legal situations. So it might be that early on there were legal implications within your family unit that affected you. So there's lots of different ways that Chiron can express itself in the ninth house. And I guess if you think about wounds, childhood wounds that are difficult to get over, what really springs to mind in this house is insecurity of worldliness, a fear of worldliness, a fear of what might happen if you're exposed to worldliness. So it really could represent somebody growing up in quite a protected environment and having those fears, all the wounds of it. Conversely, it could be that your wounds have been brought about by the worldliness that you were brought into. So for example, I was reading an article this morning about somebody who grew up in the Osho ashrams in India, and then later on in the States. And for this person who came from a very idealistic family, if you think the ninth house, it's very much about spiritualism and idealism. And this person's whole worldview was very, very different. And this person has experienced great pain from having ideologies of parents putting them out at odds with the rest of society. So this person experienced great anxiety from living in a way that didn't really match most people's expectations. So when this person chose to go into the real world, had to separate from the parents, had to separate from the community he'd grown into, and reconnect with the society. So there would be this is a great archetype that would explain the ninth house Chiron, the pain coming from idealism. I actually know somebody else who grew up in a commune in the UK and experienced very similar themes to the ones I've just described, in as much as, when you grow up with very idealistic parents, if you fall out of, as your personality and ego comes to express its true potential and its true gifts, if it's out of alignment with the spiritual values of your family, the only thing you can do really is to leave that family matrix. So there is a lot of pain there from worldliness and from the knowledge of spirituality and how that can be applied. So Chiron could be expressed in pain in a couple of different ways there. There's probably lots of other different interpretations because it's such a vast house. It covers so many different areas. In particular with the second person I mentioned, there have also been legal implications in the separation from this person and her parents. So in those two examples I gave as possible expressions for Chiron, I do need to just stress that I don't think Chiron was actually in the ninth house in those examples, but the kinds of lifestyles and problems that these people experienced could easily be represented in the birth chart by a ninth house Chiron. When it comes to transcending the ninth house Chiron, I guess the thing to realise is that self-knowledge actually can be one of the greatest things, and it can be where we find our freedom. But if you've got a ninth house Chiron, higher knowledge and spirituality and the philosophy and understanding things to a greater level can initially cause pain. Again, because I'm not talking from a client experience, I can only talk about how I think it might be represented. So, for instance, I remember many years ago, when I was living in Bali, remembering going to quite a few meetings, informing me about different things around the world, where my whole worldview was quite shattered, like really shattered. Because for most of us, we grow up with certain feelings of safety in the world, and understand that, you know, the laws and dictates that we actually accept as helpful and accept as our guiding moral compass may not actually be in our best interests. And so I hung out with different people and went to different information nights and saw different videos and had my mind completely opened to a new reality. And in that moment, I went through some probably about 6 months of quite extreme anxiety about my place in the world. Again, that's a very sort of ninth house type of concern, is, you know, what is my place in the world and how do I fit in based on this new information. And so to transcend the fear and the pain that might come across or come about through having a ninth house Chiron, the opening up to the information, the opening up to the higher implications, the opening up to the spirituality, the opening up to the philosophical debates and new viewpoints could be the thing that initially causes pain but sets us free. It could also represent how some people find grace through spiritual and religious movements. You know, that people have a time when they find their community, find their spiritual community that works for them. So all of those issues are covered well and truly in the ninth house. I would also say, if there are some hard aspects to your ninth house Chiron, then that is also going to create more tension about traditional knowledge and how it's applied. For instance, if your ninth house is in an opposition to the third house, especially if it's with an outer planet, then there's going to be some very serious outcomes to you expanding your knowledge, and that will quite dramatically affect probably how much exploration you make towards finding out new information. And it'll only be when an outer planet or a significant thing happens and triggers off that aspect that you might find yourself in the position of expanding your mind considerably, having the blinkers taken off and seeing things through a different perspective. So it's all about perspective in the ninth house. So I'm hoping that's useful for anyone out there who does have a ninth house Chiron. And I would love to hear what your experiences of the ninth house Chiron are, because as I've openly admitted here, I don't really have any direct that I'm aware of. You know, obviously I work with a lot of people, but I'm not aware of anyone with a ninth house Chiron that I've really studied. So I'd love to hear more if that's your if that's where Chiron is in your chart. Now, what happens when the ninth house is transited by Chiron? That's easier to explain, really, because this is something that we will all go through if we live to be beyond 51. We'll have all experienced what happens when Chiron goes through our ninth house. And I guess a lot of it depends on where your ninth house is and what star sign it is. Because, for instance, if you've got a ninth house ruled by Pisces or Aries, then your experience of the ninth house Chiron transit will be really great, because Chiron spends 8 or 9 years in each of these signs. So it would be a very long, slow process, your ninth house Chiron transit. Now, conversely, if your ninth house is covered by Virgo and Libra, it'll be a very, very quick transit if ninth house, when the Chiron goes through your ninth house. So a lot of it depends in importance based on, which star sign occupies your ninth house and what Chiron's orbit through it, its duration through it, what length it is. Now, the ninth house then, when it transits through the ninth house, what you need to look out for is an expansion of the mind and opportunities to have your previous mind view completely challenged and turned on the sides. It might be a time when you come to realise what your true spiritual community is and where it is. It might be a time when you fall out with your current ways of thinking and find new ways. It could be a time when you actually deal with your actual wounds and childhood pain from a philosophical and spiritual basis. So you might get the chance to completely renovate the way you think and thereby eliminate all sources of pain. It could also represent a very healing journey, or the need to take a healing journey, the need to try a different type of healing. Remember, Chiron is about healing, and most healing that people are privy to are traditional types of healing. And when I say traditional, I mean ones represented by our cultural doctors in the West. But it might be that you experience healing from a completely different perspective, a sort of spiritual healing, or healing from different belief systems, which might involve herbs and nature and food and activities, as opposed to diagnoses and tablets and prescriptions. So all aspects of healing and expansion are really covered here. What I would expect is that leading up to your ninth house transit from Chiron, your Chiron would have gone through the eighth house before. And if you've listened to the eighth house, you'll understand that it's about life, death, transitionings, and moving on to a different phase in life. So what might precede your change in belief systems is that your life has had to drastically shift a gear. There's been a natural end to one part of your life and you've gone into a new phase. A bit like the phases of from childhood to puberty, from puberty to adulthood, it might be that you've gone through the menopause and you are, and in that change, that transition from one part of life to another, it could be that your kids have left home and you're transitioning to a new phase of life. But whatever new phase of life you've transitioned to recently will be the key that triggers off the Chiron experience in relation to your mind view and how open it is. If in the previous transit, because the eighth house can represent money and other people's money, and sometimes represents inheritances and the breaking down of assets between people. If that hasn't gone very smoothly and it hasn't been resolved during that transit, then you might find that Chiron transit in the ninth house represents the legal balancing of it, because it also looks at the law and reconciliation. So there's lots of different ways that Chiron transit could occur, but all in all, it is about upgrading your spirituality, your philosophy, your ability to be open to other possibilities. So hopefully that's very helpful. And if there's anything you want to explore in relations to Chiron on the ninth house, then just give me a buzz. Take care.
You've been listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson, and this recording has been made possible by all you lovely supporters at Patreon. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.